We often take pastoral land and forests for granted. That is, until they start to disappear. But how important are forests? And I mean just forests. I'm not talking about forests with towering mountains or cascades of waterfalls, just plain old woodlots, even suburban forests. How important are these places to our natural heritage? Well, the Clemson Forest is one of these places, and I have to admit that I didn't know much about it until just a couple years ago. But now, I drive through this forest every day on my way to work, and I'm constantly amazed at the things that I find here. Join me on today's expedition as we explore this land of change and a forest that's full of surprises. Change is the one part of nature that you can depend upon. And change has operated dramatically in the Clemson Experimental Forest. The forest is 17,500 acres of working woodland and pastoral land acquired during the New Deal, largely through the Bankhead-Jones Farm Tenant Act. This region was decimated, worn out, and heavily eroded farmland. But you'd never know it by driving through the forest today. It looks natural, and it looks recovered, but the scars of poor land use remain. To get a very rare glimpse into the Piedmont before European colonization, you can visit the all-natural area. This natural area is named for the man who led the charge to acquire and protect the Clemson Forest, George H. All. I meet plant ecologist Vic and we start down the trail. Along the way, Vic points out that even though this looks like a natural forest, we're actually standing on the remnants of an old cotton field. The topsoil was lost, so today we're left with only a shallow organic layer and that brick-hard red clay, the subsoil, that we're all so familiar with here in the Piedmont. But just a short ways down the trail, everything changes.
Well, look at this, Patrick. Quite a difference, don't you think?
That's absolutely amazing. And we've gone from a site that was just young pines and a few hardwoods coming up underneath to a site that are these gigantic trees, and they're not all the same age. It's a mixed age stand, so we've got some huge red oaks and white oaks and beech in here, and then smaller ones too. It's a mixed age stand, uneven age
It's
stand.
all different age classes. This is a Piedmont relic, really, in a sense that, and there's two factors here which are making this site very unique. First, it's a north-facing slope. Of course, what happens when you're north-facing, you're cooler and
sun's
moister.
not shining right on the slope all the time, so decomposition slower, you get more buildup of organics, and you're not losing as much water.
Right. And we know we've cored these trees, and they're about 200 years old, which means probably the late 1700s it was cut.
If it was cut.
If it was cut. We're fairly certain because most of the area was cut at least once.
Dying to see the soil and see what an original Piedmont soil looks like.
See. That's our next stop.
Great. Now this is one of my favorite things about living here in this part of South Carolina and being able to enjoy the Clemson Forest. This time in the spring we get flowers on our painted buckeyes. And what color are the flowers on painted buckeye?
Normally pink around here.
Pink around here. That's right, but this is special. Normally, painted buckeye flowers are green. And a lot of people look at these pink flowers and they'll use the North Carolina wildflower book and they'll say, oh, they're reddish pink. They must be red buckeye. And they think this is the true red buckeye, which is Aesculus pavia. It's not. This is Aesculus sylvatica, but it has a little bit of pavia in it. This is an example where, because red buckeye has those red tubular flowers, it's pollinated by
hummingbirds.
Absolutely. Red tubular flowers attract hummingbirds. These things flower in the spring when ruby-throated hummingbirds are migrating. They'll feed on the red buckeye down in the low country, and as they come up the Savannah River drainage migrating, they feed on sylvatica. They still have pollen from the red buckeye on their bill.
Oh, really? Okay.
This thing gets cross-pollinated, and what's happened here in the Blue Ridge Escarpment region and upper Piedmont of South Carolina is we've incorporated a few genes from the red buckeye, just an all-around neat species, the painted buckeye. This is one of the true gems of the Clemson Forest.
interesting thing.
This one piece will make 52 layers.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required.
Well, Patrick, I told you a little bit of a lie. I said this area hadn't been disturbed at all, but actually, about 25 years ago, we created a nice big soil pit here so that we could show people. And because it's north-facing, it's steep, and it wasn't cut, we have a really beautiful soil profile to show you here.
Right.
And it's obvious here that if you just grab hold of some of this topsoil here.
Oh, yeah, it's something that we all wish we had in the garden. I mean, my gosh.
Brown, coarse,
friable
fluffy,
soil.
Easy for roots to penetrate, and you can see the roots have definitely taken advantage of this situation.
So we lost how much soil with agriculture here in this part of the state?
At least a foot in this particular situation. Now, it's probably anywhere from 6 to 12 inches of soil that we lost. It's down in the ocean now.
Yeah.
Long gone and not, you can't get it back except by the long-term process of soil building.
So here we have a foot, 2 feet of topsoil of a horizon. So we're talking about 1,000 years per inch.
Yeah,
and
got a long way to wait.
That's a long way to wait till we get back to this.
Yeah, very rich soil.
Now, there's a ton of downed wood in these older growth forests, and I guess that's typical, isn't it?
Right, we just saw that huge log up above there, and that had fallen, and it's very typical because all trees do die sooner or later, and in an old growth forest like this, you get a lot of coarse woody debris on the ground.
Yeah, it's amazing. And of course, we have huge living trees as well. And the monarch of all these in here has got to be the American beech.
Exactly, very shade tolerant, needs the shade of other trees to grow well, and this one's been here a long time.
Yeah,
sort of proving that this has been here undisturbed for many, many years.
I mean, this is one of the slowest growing trees we have.
Right.
And to get a tree this size, I don't even want to guess how old
No.
this giant old beech is. But what amazes me about beech trees is no matter how far away from a trail or out in the wilderness a beech tree is, eventually somebody's going to carve their name on the side of it.
And it stays there a long time because the bark is very slow growing.
So whoever TR and JG are, I hope they're having
a good time.
They probably had their 50th wedding anniversary by now.
Easily.
But you know, these wonderful soil conditions, this high pH soil has allowed us to develop one of the nicest shows of wildflowers that you find anywhere in the Piedmont. And there are May-apples here, lots of May-apples in full flower right now in middle April, and trillium, one of the neat trillium that come down into the Piedmont here. You have to look underneath the leaves of that trillium to find the flower. This beautiful white flower with the deep maroon stamens is southern nodding trillium. And even the phlox here. We have this beautiful blue phlox that's actually very rare in South Carolina. Phlox stolonifera, creeping along. This is common name, I guess, is trailing phlox. It's an amazing place, and all year long we'll see a procession of wildflowers from these early spring species right on through summer and right into fall. Yeah. One thing after another that makes this one of the greatest natural areas that I know of in this part of the state, and one of the real gems.
It's a Heritage Trust area and a Society of American Foresters natural area also.
Fantastic.
So it's a great place to come and visit.
The all-natural area is only one of the many surprises that you can find here in the South Clemson Forest. I drive through this forest every day on my way to work, and one of my favorite stops is along 18 Mile Creek, home to some of the most incredible wetlands that I know of anywhere in the Piedmont. As we move up the 18 Mile Creek drainage here in the South Forest, we enter an area that's absolutely littered with large and just majestic wetlands. Most of these are beaver ponds. They're natural wetlands, but they're created by a creature. They're created, in this case, by a beaver, of course. And when you look out here on this beautiful, expansive wetland, you notice there's lots of duck boxes here. This is a great site for wood ducks. You come here pretty much any time of the year, you're guaranteed to see wood ducks. And as I was walking up here, I just spooked out a female and 5 or 6 chicks that came right off the bank here. And the neatest thing of all, these old rotten logs that hang out over top of this water provide home for prothonotary warblers, but they're also providing a nesting cavity for tree swallows. And tree swallows are one of the most beautiful birds that we have in the upstate of South Carolina, and a bird that was only first reported breeding here just a couple years ago. And today, we're finding them breeding throughout this part of the Clemson Forest, almost always on old dead snags that hang out over top of the water in that beautiful
violet-green iridescent back and a clean, clear white throat and belly are great distinguishing marks for that species. It's one of 4 swallows that we see here this time of year. Cliff swallows, rough-winged swallows, which are actually sitting right up on the stick out in front of me here, that breed in banks, cliff swallows and barn swallows, the 4 swallows that we have commonly here in the Clemson Forest. Just amazing to me that all of this time that I've been working at Clemson University, I never knew that a site as spectacular and diverse as the South Clemson Forest was sitting less than 2 miles from where I live.
The wetlands are full of life this time of year. But May is also a busy time for our slithering friends.
And this is one of the great things about being out in the woods in the springtime. It's not just great for birds, it's a fantastic time of year to see reptiles. When the temperatures out here get up into the upper 70s, low 80s in May, it's just a fantastic time to catch snakes like this out basking, and you actually can get up pretty close to them. This guy here is one of the most common snakes in South Carolina, and it's a rat snake, but we call it a corn snake. The corn snake, just like all rat snakes, specializes in eating mammals, rodents. So it's very beneficial to us, and it's harmless. It's non-venomous. I'll try to show you why he's called a corn snake, but I think you're going to find out real quick why this snake in the wild state is not quite as nice as the ones we keep in captivity. You see him rattling his tail there. That means he's getting a little bit mad at me, and he's likely to bite me. Let's see if we can get him up here without biting me. Oh, you're a good snake, aren't you? Take a look at his belly. The belly of the snake is patterned with these little flecks, and apparently it reminded people of Indian corn. And from Indian corn, we probably get the name corn snake. It's a beautiful snake, and one of 19 species that's found here in the Clemson Forest. And it's a good example of a widespread species, but we have snakes that are found mostly in the coastal plain, but sometimes found up here in the Clemson Forest region, really at the edge of the range, and some that are right at the southern edge of the range. They don't make it any farther downstate than right here in the Clemson Forest. So it's really a meeting place of snakes that are more common on the coast and more common up here. And we'll let you get back to your business.
The beaver ponds and wetlands here are great places to see wildlife you'd never think would be here, or maybe never even knew existed, like the swamp rabbit. This is a semi-aquatic and very shy rabbit. They're only known from this corner of the state in South Carolina. You might not expect a place this far inland to be great for shorebirds. But during migration, leaf sandpipers, semi-palmated plovers, and the widespread spotted sandpipers are always at hand. These 3 are well documented from the forest. But this spring, a drought year, there's plenty of birds that aren't even on the official list.
If you want to keep banker's hours and still do some bird watching, one of your best bets is to look at shorebirds. These guys keep pretty civilized hours. You don't look for them out here singing in the morning. You look for them when they're out here foraging. So especially during migration, first couple weeks in May, you can come out here right in the middle of the day to my favorite spot to see shorebirds, which is this wonderful large marsh that's exposed when Lake Hartwell's down on 18 Mile Creek. And right up here in this little pool, we have just an amazing assortment of some of the most beautiful shorebirds that we find coming through this area. So we've got greater yellowlegs and lesser yellowlegs up there, and also the one solitary sandpiper. You're wondering how it gets that name? There's one of them out there. We've got 4 yellowlegs, greater yellowlegs, 1 lesser yellowleg, and 1 solitary sandpiper. Right now, they're coming out of the grass and starting to forage. When we first got here, they were bobbing their heads up and down. And when these birds bob their heads up and down, they're really nervous. They know you're watching them. This is a perfect opportunity to see the difference between the greater yellowlegs and the lesser yellowlegs, because right now they're standing right side by side. That lesser yellowlegs is really out there consuming insects, especially aquatic insect larvae, and we can't really see what he's eating. He's still a little too far away to see what he's grabbing, but those greater yellowlegs, I've been sitting here watching them, seeing something absolutely amazing. These guys are gorging themselves on tadpoles. Look at this guy going right after a big tadpole, trying to stuff it down and getting it down. That's something amazing, because I haven't even seen that listed in the literature as being a major part of their diet. But this year, we've had a little bit of rain in the spring. It's filled up these temporary ponds, provided a perfect place for those frogs to breed, and there's just an abundance of tadpoles here, and that may be why they've stayed here so long. That's really what I love about shorebirds. Super long distance migrants. They may come from South Florida, Central America, South America, all the way up into North Carolina, South Carolina, and then continue all the way up to Canada. And they may only spend a few weeks on the wintering ground, a few weeks in the breeding ground, and really just as much time here. And I think we often underestimate how important these little stopovers are. It's kind of interesting here because all three of these species that we're seeing out here are really birds that are not on the official list of species known from the Clemson Forest. So we've added 3 species just today, right here. Let's see how close we can get to them and see what else might be lying in this little remnant pond. That nervous bobbing that the yellowlegs do is one of the best ways to identify that bird, and they are very skittish. So they flew off as soon as I got close to this pond. But there's a lot else out here moving around, and this is a perfect time to come visit these ponds in the marsh. A lot of dragonflies, you got blue dashers, great big pond hawks, and beautiful whitetails out here. But I saw this guy actually from back there moving around in the mud, and I think that's where they get their common name for this turtle. This is the eastern mud turtle, and it's one of the cutest little turtles. It's not a flashy turtle. It's not as brilliantly colored as the southern painted turtle that we just saw here in this pond also. Then it doesn't spend a lot of time basking, and it doesn't spend a lot of time up floating on the surface. This turtle spends his days walking around under the water, foraging for basically anything he can catch. There's a lot of food in here for eastern mud turtles, and it's one of probably 8 species of turtle that's found here. You know, turtles are fascinating, and mud turtle just as fascinating as any others, because these are the only animals that I know of where the actual pelvis and the shoulder blades are actually inside of the rib cage. If we look at a dead shell of a box turtle or even a mud turtle, we'll notice that the backbone is held right here along the base of the carapace of the shell. And the carapace itself, the top part of the shell, that's the rib cage. The ribs have been modified outward, and all those parts that we have on the outside of our rib cage have been moved and tucked inside, so this guy can carry his home around with him and ball up into it, because he doesn't have much else to defend himself against predators. So we'll let this guy go, and it's just amazing how fast they bury back down underneath that mud. And by the way, if you're wondering how they breathe when they're under that mud, they do it through their back end. They actually do something called cloacal pumping, where they'll draw water in and out of their backside and actually exchange oxygen there. So it's almost like having gills, but in a slightly more disgusting manner.
A ton of lake bottom has already been exposed and transformed into wetland. But as the season progresses, severe drought sets in, and the wetlands dry out completely.
When you have extreme drought years like this one, and Lake Hartwell dries way down, it exposes that lake bottom that's all mucky and wet still, and you get a wonderland of wildflowers. Well, a wonderland of weeds, like all these smartweeds that I'm surrounded by here. It's just incredible. I've seen at least 5 species of smartweed right here, but 2 main species here of smartweed or knotweed in the genus Polygonum, and it just creates a beautiful showcase of flowers in the late summer, early fall. And in large part, this is why there's so many waterfowl here at 18 Mile Creek. Lots of plant diversity during dry years, and when they die and this area gets flooded again, it floods up all those seeds. Perfect food for waterfowl. All the insects they're feeding here, perfect food for other songbirds, even the shorebirds that we have here. Even in dry years, the Clemson Forest is a wonderland. There's almost no water left in 18 Mile Creek, but I saw one of the coolest animals right here. Just saw his head and his snorkel sticking up out of the sand. I'll see if I can dig around in here and find him, because he's really one of the neatest animals that we have. Look at that, in the Carolinas, hidden out under the sand and perfectly blended to match the sand. Goodness gracious. Probably a newborn of this year, softshell turtle. This is a spiny softshell turtle. And we call them softshell turtles because the shell itself is soft. Soft shells are the only turtles that we have in fresh water in the Carolinas that have a shell that's soft and pliable. He is colored just like a male spiny softshell, and when you feel the back of the shell of a male spiny softshell, you understand why they're called spiny. The back of the shell is covered with little projections that make it feel rough, just like sandpaper. Spiny softshells are uniquely adapted to living in aquatic environments. He's got these really short, strong forearms and back legs, and his feet entirely webbed. Perfect for moving through the water. Another adaptation this guy has is this snorkel on the end of his nose. This long snorkel allows him to stay underwater and only stick that snorkel up to breathe, so he never has to really leave the water. And in fact, he can sit down here camouflaged in this sand and just stick that snorkel up out of the sand, out of the water, and just sit there and wait for something to come along to eat. And one of the most unique, bizarre, and unusual reptiles we have in South Carolina. Maintaining a healthy forest doesn't just mean preserving the property itself. You also have to preserve ecosystem function. When Europeans first encountered these woodlands, they encountered a very different looking place. It's because they burned. Now that process of burning was really removed from most of the Piedmont and upstate of South Carolina a little over 100 years ago. The advent of agriculture and the beginning of fire suppression. But here on the Clemson Forest, we're reintroducing and maintaining our woodlands with just those processes. So here, this site is getting ready to go through a massive transformation today. We're going to light the world on fire. "24 hours after the burn, and while it's still smoking, the place, it looks devastated. It looks like most of the woody plants are wilted or burn up. But what we're about to see here is not death and devastation, it's rebirth. This habitat here is just amazing in the fall, following a fire. You come out here and you see just a field full of native grasses, things you see in tall grass prairie, and just a beautiful display of fall flowering wildflowers. These plants in this natural community would not be possible to be here without fire. Turns out that early naturalists and early land surveyors, people like William Bartram and John Lawson, who traveled through the Piedmont of the Carolinas, tell us that the Piedmont landscape has changed dramatically since their visits. They describe a landscape of widely spaced trees and barren hilltops. They're really covered with habitat that was very prairie-like, or like savannas that we have in the coastal plain today. This habitat type is all but extinct in the Carolinas today. Only tiny fragments on roadsides and in power lines and places like this exist. And when you think about flowers that bloom in the fall, native flowers, you probably think about asters. And we have a lot of asters here. But there's one aster here, and to me it's the most beautiful aster in the Carolinas. It's really found in this habitat and nowhere else on Earth. It's right over here, and I think you're gonna love it. Well, this is it. The Georgia aster, Symphiatricum georgianum. What a beautiful plant. Those deep, dark, purple, petal-like flowers around the outside of this inflorescence, group of flowers, help to distinguish it. I said a group of flowers. It looks like I'm holding one flower in my hand, but in fact, I'm holding many, many flowers. In the aster family, things like daisies, asters, goldenrod, what appears to be one flower is actually a collection of many. It's a composite. So when you play that old childhood game of picking off these petals and saying, she loves me not, you're picking off entire flowers. These flowers around the outside of an aster are actually called ray flowers. In the center, we have this collection of smaller 5-petaled flowers that are called disc flowers. One of our largest flowering asters and one of the latest flowering asters that we have in South Carolina. This one doesn't start flowering until late October, sometimes even early November. Because it flowers so late, it's pollinated mostly by bumblebees, carpenter bees. And every so often we'll see one visiting a flower, and if you come out here early in the morning when it's really cool in the fall, you'll actually see bumblebees looking like they're asleep on the flower. Bumblebees are active at lower temperatures than most of our other bee species, so they're perfect pollinators for things that live at high elevations or flower early in the spring or late in the fall, like Georgia aster. We have some of the largest populations in the world of this plant, and it's probably one of the places where this plant has its greatest stronghold. It's considered rare in each state it occurs in, and it's limited to the Piedmont, and today it's even considered what we call a candidate for federal listing. So a symbol of times past, and a plant that's not doing very well today, but doing well where we have good management practices like this. It's a beautiful plant, and you just wait all year to see these masses in flower here in the Clemson Experimental Forest. In any season, the Clemson Experimental Forest is a treasure trove of beauty and diversity. Diversity of habitats, but also a diversity of life. Large tracts of forest and traditional use lands are a critical part of maintaining our natural heritage. But understanding that change is a part of these systems is also crucial for managing them. If you ever get a chance to visit this area, I invite you to check out the Clemson Experimental Forest and explore the treasures that are hidden right in plain sight. I'm Patrick McMillan, wishing you your own exciting expedition.
In the 1700s, over 70 million acres and the majority of the uplands of the southeastern coastal plain was covered with longleaf pine habitat. This is one of the most diverse landscapes in the temperate world today. Less than 2% remains in its original condition. What happened? And how does this fire-maintained habitat work? And what exactly lives there? Join me on today's expedition as we explore the heart of the longleaf empire. We begin our exploration of this system in the Apalachicola National Forest, one of the largest remaining tracts of longleaf pine habitat left.
Longleaf pine, by far my favorite conifer. This is a plant that is really adapted for fire. It's adapted to want to burn. This incredible, strange appearance that it has when it's young like this is all part of the strategy of how this incredible plant has managed to absolutely dominate this habitat's canopy. How does it do it? Well, it starts out surviving fire when the cones open and release seeds out into the habitat. And if those seeds land in the right spot, they germinate, but they don't create a tall, upright tree quickly. They sit there in what we call a grass stage, looking almost like a wiregrass plant, just a small little short bundle of grass-like long needles. And it sits there growing a deep, strong taproot until it generates enough energy and stores enough energy to be able to shoot up into what we call the bottle brush stage. And in a matter of only 2 or 3 years, it'll be over head high. And a matter of maybe 7 or 8 years after it leaves that grass stage, it'll be in what we call the candelabra stage, a short tree starting to branch out. This idea of having these long needles that will sort of fall down as fire burns from the base and suffocate the fire before it gets to the growth point is a great adaptation for surviving low-intensity ground fires. But the lower branches catch fire and they burn off. Therefore, a forest-grown, fire-exposed longleaf like the one behind me, they don't have lower branches. They were burned off decades ago by the kiss of fire. Everything about the plant made to survive fire. The grass stage, fire burns right over it. The growing buds protected way down deep. Once they reach the bottle brush stage, a few of them die, but the growth point is usually saved. And when you reach this stage, you're essentially fireproof. You'd have to have some really hot flames that reach 50, 60 feet up in the sky to bother this guy. The other thing that's really cool, almost unbelievable about this habitat, is that the pine seems to work in conjunction with the grasses here to not just survive fire, but to generate it. And we can see why right over here. This habitat is made to burn, but you know what? It's adapted to burn down here on the ground level. And it's really the architecture of what's going on down here that provides the fuel that ignites the fire. And the needles of the pine itself, which are actually scattered all through this wiregrass, provide great and really readily flammable material for fire itself. So even without the grass, this stuff burns like crazy. But the thing is, there's barely anything that'll burn as quick, ignite as quick as wiregrass. Even when it's moist, this drier stuff will just light up and burn with a fury. And so it works in conjunction with the trees naturally. You see, these trees all grow up to nearly the same size, but sometimes one sticks up above the others. It gets hit by lightning. And when lightning hits these trees and that bolt comes down the stem, it comes into contact with all this dry tinder that's piled up around the trees, and you've started a fire naturally. Well, growing season fires probably ignited that way over all of the southeastern United States. And without the fire breaks that human beings have put into the landscape today, those fires could burn mile after mile. Maybe half a state could burn in a single event if there were no major fire breaks in between. But the thing is, fires probably occurred more frequently than could be explained by lightning strike. Turns out human beings themselves are one of the major keys to the ignition of this habitat.
So the pines and wiregrass are well suited to fire and they'll recover quickly. But what about the rest of the plants?
The speed at which the longleaf pine, flatwoods, and savannas recover after fire is kind of staggering. It's mind-boggling. This site that today looks so fresh and clean and green and rejuvenated only burned around 3 to 4 weeks ago. It's hard to imagine that this was a charred, blackened landscape less than a month ago, and today it's almost like a fairy tale of these beautiful white flowers mixed with these wonderful green asters that are just getting ready to burst into bloom. A species called reticulated aster, which is really common right after a fire. And all of this flowering, all these white flowers, the yellow flowers, the savanna pityopsis that's out here, these were stimulated to bloom by the fire itself. You see, many of the species that are here aren't just architecturally made for fire, but they also are so well adapted and in tune with it that they are promoted to flower, set seed, and drop that seed when there's still some vacant, barren ground around after a fire has come through and liberated them of the suffocating shade from all the interwoven grasses of the savanna. It's always prettiest out here right after a fire. So this plant that's all around me here is kind of an interesting one. It's called death camas. That's not a really attractive name for such an attractive species, but it's actually related to a group of plants that are all known by the name death camas. And most of the plants in this family have poison or death in the name because they have nasty toxic alkaloids in all parts of the plant that would make you not want to eat it. So an incredible group of plants. Even the butterflies are back. I mean, we just were sitting here watching a beautiful zebra swallowtail. He was actually a little beat up. You could tell a bird had gotten onto him, but he was actually out here nectaring, feeding on these death camas flowers. Incredible place, and it's just neat to see how quickly a place like this is rejuvenated by fire.
Plants may form the base of this system, but everything that lives here is adapted to fire. To delve deeply into the animal life of this system, we travel north to the Francis Marion National Forest. Nearly 259,000 acres of public land, much of it blanketed by longleaf. You might find it surprising that there are birds that depend on fire for survival. The Bachmann Sparrow, for instance, is almost exclusively found in this habitat, and its range mirrors that of longleaf pine. This small brown bird is highly secretive, but its sweet voice is one of the telltale signs of a healthy longleaf pine forest. No bird symbolizes the plight of this system and its connection with longleaf pine better than the red-cockaded woodpecker. At one time, there were well over 1 million family groups across the range of longleaf, but today, there are only an estimated 14,000 birds, a decline of over 98%. Prior to Hurricane Hugo's destructive winds in 1989, there were around 475 pairs in the forest, and this was the only naturally increasing population anywhere in the world. Hugo halved that number, but lots of hard work and artificial cavities put here by researchers have turned things around. We meet with biologist Larry Wood to see a small portion of the intense work that goes into monitoring and recovering this rare bird. Larry carefully removes chicks, bands them, and records data in the study area here in the Francis Marion.
We try to catch them between like 7 to 10 days of age, which 6 and 8 to 9 days is the best, because you have to get 3 color bands on one leg.
Some of these birds are destined to be moved to other areas to begin the chore of recovery there.
We've had a super exciting morning already out here with Larry Wood, working with red cockaded woodpecker chicks. And I've never seen a red cockaded woodpecker chick before, so that was super cool to see these birds so up close. But this bird symbolizes, for me and for most of us, this habitat, the longleaf pine system. Whether you're talking about sandhills or flatwoods or savanna, this bird is tightly associated with this tree, and it's not just a tree, but it's this structure. So give us a little background here with the National Forest. How many birds do we have today, and how has that population fared over time?
The population has done really well here, and prior to Hurricane Hugo, which probably most people around in South Carolina are familiar with it, it knocked down approximately 80% of the cavity trees in the forest.
Right. And
the population was cut in half, probably around 220 breeding pairs or clusters, what we call them, groups of breeding birds. And approximately now there's 465 or so, and it's really hard to get an accurate count. We're basing that on a survey every 5 years. We're just juxtapositioning the estimation of the population.
So this is a bird that, when I started working in longleaf pine systems way back in the mid-'80s, it seemed like it was probably a bird that would never make it. But here we've actually seen it. We've seen it increasing.
Yes.
And doing well, and we're actually using birds from here to transplant elsewhere.
Yes. The most important thing with the Francis Marion population is that after Hurricane Hugo, they started an artificial cavity insulation program, and every year they're installing a certain number of artificial cavities, and that's really helped the population come back to levels similar to prior to Hugo.
So let's talk about this habitat, because you were talking about a woodpecker, and a woodpecker lives up in the trees. So it's easy to understand why it chooses these trees, because of the open nature and center that it can get a cavity into. But why does it need this structure? I guess that's the big question. I mean, woodpeckers live in the trees. They don't really spend time on the ground, but we only find red-cockaded woodpeckers in these open, structured forests with a grassy understory.
I would assume that they're not very good flyers, so they want to be able to keep an eye out for hawks and other predators in their area.
Sure.
And also, I believe that it allows the trees to produce more sap so that rat snakes cannot get into their nesting tree, so that more sunlight, the higher productivity of that individual tree.
Right, and higher productivity, I guess, of the whole system,
yes,
leading to more insect production, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, and these guys feed a little different than a lot of other woodpeckers, I guess. These are actually...
Normal woodpeckers are foraging on dead trees, excavating grubs and larvae out of dead trees, whereas this bird will forage on live trees and just kind of flake underneath the bark to grab spiders and roaches and other insects.
The connection with the ground may be higher productivity on the ground, higher amount of insects making it into the trees, and
yes,
more food for the bird.
Yep.
It's kind of interesting too, they're not just feeding in these living trees, this is where they make their homes, right?
That's correct, yes. It's the only bird that I know of, and I'm pretty certain it's the only bird in the world, the woodpecker, that excavates a cavity in a live tree, and it will use that cavity year-round unless another species takes it over, such as the red-headed woodpecker. And flying squirrels are a problem that will take over red-cockaded woodpecker cavities as well.
So give to me the challenges. What are the challenges moving forward with red-cockaded woodpeckers?
Even though the population on Francis Marion has come back to prior to Hugo, it's more concentrated now into the areas that they're regularly burning. So one of the main challenges is for them to be able to expand their burning program to other sections of the forest in the urban interface. Yeah. And I think that is the main challenge facing red-cockaded woodpeckers management on Francis Marion in the future.
It's all a matter of scale.
Yep. And one other thing that because of Hurricane Hugo, some of these stands, like here, this is a very pretty and open stand, but there's not a whole lot of mature trees, so we're probably going to have to continue to install artificial cavities for a longer term than most forests would have to that had mature trees. Yeah,
and so when this habitat burns, even when they're in the cavities, it's okay?
Yes, it's fine. And actually, there's one nest that I could show you that I abandoned the nestlings. They were approximately 7 to 8 days of age. Then 3 days later, they burnt the forest and the nestlings survived.
Let's go take a look.
Larry has a really cool camera scope that he uses to visually inspect nests without having to climb the tree.
And this is that tree after I abandoned the nestlings. They came in, I didn't even know they were going to, but they burnt this portion of the forest 3 days after I abandoned these nestlings. So they were approximately 11 to 12 days old when they burnt this forest. And I came back after the fire, and the nestlings did fine. They're all three still. They're all three in there still alive.
Oh man, there you go, feathered out and everything.
Yes. So there's 3 nestlings in there. I don't know if we're going to be able to see it. One of them's covered up by the other 2 nestlings now. Can't quite see them. Since we're going to be moving pairs of birds in the fall, we want to know whether they're males or females now. So if there's 3 nestlings in there and they're all 3 males, We know
Right.
what the color combination is, the sex with that color combination. But if we get the ratio of males to females, and I'll come back with a spotting scope, identify the birds by color bands, and then see the top of its head and use that to sex them with a spotting scope.
So where do these birds end up when they're relocated?
Some of them end up on private land, and some of them have gone to other public land. And in the past, when I was doing the translocation with the SRTC, which is the Southern Range Translocation Committee, we actually had birds that left Francis Marion and went to Talladega National Forest in Alabama.
Yeah.
Some went to Ocala National Forest in southern Florida. Some went to the Jones Center in Georgia, and I think 3 pairs went to the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge.
Wow.
And some went to Matsu, which is a military base in North Carolina.
Though the woodpecker may steal the spotlight, there are many other animals that depend on these woodlands and wetlands. U.S. Forest Service biologist Mark Donaher and Mike Martin meet us to show us an exciting project attempting to document what exactly is here.
So Patrick, we're really interested in understanding what types of rare species of reptiles and amphibians we have on the Francis Marion National Forest. Although people have been looking at herps on the forest for years and years, we really never did any comprehensive surveys. And so many species are becoming rarer and rarer with each day. And the Forest Service is really interested in finding out where these species occur on the Francis Marion, what types of habitats they're using. This project really started out as a very small project and has really turned out to be just a quintessential example of a partnership in action. And we've got DNR involved, we've got U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service, Wofford University. So it's really turned out into an outstanding project. But this is going to allow us to find those cryptic species, as you know, that are so hard to find just haphazardly walking through the woods, and so will give us a very good idea what type of species are occurring on the National Forest.
A drift fence array has been laid out here. Animals hit the 100-foot-long aluminum flashing and follow it until they're funneled into traps that allow Mike and Mark to retrieve them, record them, and send them on their way. Mike checks these traps daily, and these traps record animals that you'd spend years searching for otherwise.
All right, Patrick, well, we've got some of the animals that we've captured out of some of our fences over the past day or so over here.
Oh, super.
Just wanted to share some of those with you. Actually, this first one looks a lot like a snake, but is not. So this is a very interesting little reptile.
Oh, that's so awesome. Attenuata. This is the slender glass lizard, which is the one I never see. Look at the length of that tail on this thing and how slender it really is. Pop off if we handle it too roughly, but
An
cool.
adult with a full original tail is really sort
rare.
of a treat that you don't often get.
And we can tell it's a lizard, not a snake, even though it is missing, of course, all of its legs by some of its other anatomical features, like...
You've got eyelids. That's something that excludes all snakes. Snakes do not blink. They do not have the eyelids.
Right.
And
ears.
On top of that, you've got an ear hole.
Yeah, you got an
so
ear
if you
hole.
look close enough, you can actually see the holes to the ears. And then a little bit beyond that, you see this other feature, which is the lateral groove.
Yeah.
That, you know, is just a little bit of expansion for the body and all that. They have a fairly rigid body overall, but that lateral groove allows them to breathe, probably pass a little bit more food and whatnot.
I've only ever seen one really small one in the wild, so that's really neat to see a large, slender glass like that.
We've got some other snakes. So you don't often think of snakes being really nice, bright, colorful animals.
Right.
But we've got a couple here that are really interesting ones.
Awesome. The classic for this habitat for longleaf pine flatwoods, of course, is the scarlet king snake, and they don't come any more beautiful than that. That beautiful red nose, and typically found in this kind of habitat.
Yes.
Tell us about the biology, because it's not one you're going to come out here and find walking along the ground.
No, not often. You know, that'd be a rare case if you did. These, as is the case with many of our sandy soil species, are fossorial snakes.
Right.
So they spend the vast majority of their time just underground.
Right, and that's what fossorial means, is just these are snakes that spend their time underground.
These animals come up at night. They might be foraging, they might be looking for mates, and they'll come up, become detectable if we were out here in the night, and then they'll hit our fences and fall into our traps, and we can easily find them that way.
And this is thought to be an example of, oftentimes touted at least as an example of Batesian mimicry, of trying to mimic a coral snake. And how do you tell the difference between a scarlet king and a coral snake?
Well, there's a couple different ways, but everybody has their own little rhyme. Some variation of red touches yellow, kill a fellow, red touches black, friend of Jack.
Right.
So if you look at this snake, you can see the red bands touch on the black bands.
Yes, awesome. And a species that feeds a lot of times on other reptiles, right?
Correct.
It's kind of a specialist on lizards and small snakes.
Now, at first glance, our next snake is going to look like the same snake we just showed you.
Oh, no.
But it's actually fairly different.
And it is very different, and different biology and different food. This is a scarlet snake. It specializes in feeding on eggs.
Tile eggs.
And yeah, you might confuse it with a scarlet king snake, but actually this animal has these blotches and a relatively clear pattern on the underside, and those blotches are just super cool. That's brilliant. That's beautiful. And also shares with the scarlet king snake. That sort of reddish color on the front of the head. Beautiful snakes.
The king of all reptiles found in this habitat is one that in all the years I've worked in the Francis Marion, I've never seen here. This snake, more than any other, has declined due to persecution by man and loss of habitat. Mark and Mike are part of a team that has worked tirelessly to find and implant transmitters in a few. This allows them to gather crucial information on their movements and habitat preference, but it also gives us a fighting chance to actually see one.
That's a beautiful, beautiful little snake, isn't it? Not so small as rattlesnakes go, but small for this species, and really beautiful pattern on that one. So tell me, diamondback rattlesnakes here in this forest, you're championing learning more about them. Why do we want to have diamondback rattlesnakes around?
That's probably the most common question I get is like, why would we care about a venomous snake species? And the answer is really simple. That animal right there provides a perfect indicator to the overall health of your ecosystem. If you have that animal present in your ecosystem, you know you've got a healthy, functioning ecosystem. And in particular, here on the Francis Marion is like, these snakes are keying into fire-maintained longleaf pine woodlands and savannas. And so we know where we're finding them that they're healthy, functioning ecosystems.
We're doing good if you can find a diamondback rattlesnake.
And from hunters, from quail hunters to turkey hunters to school-age children, it's like this snake is a symbol of our southern heritage.
And this snake is headed towards loss. I just can't seem to impress enough upon people. Look at that snake. Put your fears aside and look at the beautiful patterns and the beautiful colors and the behavior on this snake, and think about how unique that is among all things on planet Earth. That is my favorite species of rattlesnake, and it's declining just terribly throughout its range, partly because of what we've been talking about, loss of fire in the habitat, loss of this incredible habitat, but also because of incursion and persecution. And I think people think that you come here and you can find a diamondback rattlesnake in every stump hole. And how many total have you found during this project?
We have literally spent thousands of person hours searching for eastern diamondbacks, and to date have only found 6 individuals.
Your odds of actually seeing this snake are pretty small, and in the best habitat for this species, I've only seen a handful without actually being shown where they were, like this one.
They're such long-lived species, they don't reach sexual maturity until they're extremely old.
9-10 years to reach maturity, and then every other year they're producing young, and they're live bears. They give birth to live young, oviviparous species, which a lot of folks don't know that either, that there are snakes, and in particular crotalids, all give live birth, and they don't give birth to a lot of young.
Nope.
So a really long recovery time for such a beautiful animal, and really they are at the edge of still being part of our Southern heritage and part of our South Carolina heritage. And that is the importance of these incredibly large pieces of federal land.
Yes.
It's a place where every bit of our heritage gets a chance to survive.
The hard work of the Forest Service staff here has resulted in fire being applied across a large chunk of habitat. But that is the exception today in the low country of South Carolina. And that's evident as we examine one of the rarest plants found here.
This is American chaffseed, Schwalbe americana. Certainly not the most beautiful plant that you've probably ever seen. Matter of fact, the flowers barely open. They sort of look like they're dead already, even when they're in the peak of bloom. But this plant used to be abundant all the way from Long Island down through Texas, all through the coastal plain. of the eastern United States, you found American chastity growing in habitats that aren't that much different than this. Habitats that burned annually, biennially, once every few years, but depended on fire. This plant is partially parasitic on grasses like little bluestem, sometimes other plants even like the Pidiopsis, the silk grasses, but a partially parasitic plant that requires fire to open up the habitat and requires fire to bloom and really thrive. And today, as a consequence of needing frequent fire, chastity is found in only a teeny tiny percentage of its former range. South Carolina by far has the largest populations of this federally endangered species, and probably the best chance for this plant anywhere in South Carolina surviving long term is right here in the Francis Marion National Forest. Every year, each one of these plants is counted and surveyed by Jeff Glitzenstein and Donna Strang. And that couple comes out here on their time and really cares for and looks at the management that we're doing here in the Francis Marion, all with the goal of providing a place for something that 99.999% of the people in the world will never even know existed. Regardless of whether you care anything about this plant, you probably at least care that there are scenes like this that are truly and uniquely South Carolinian. And without fire, you don't have either one.
The big challenge here is continuing to burn in an increasingly suburban landscape. Fire here has been both natural and man-made. Native Americans were burning the landscape on a nearly annual basis for hundreds, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of years. Today, the lack of fire threatens nearly every species found in these habitats.
This probably looks a lot like the woods behind your house, especially if you live anywhere between, Washington, D.C., Central Florida, and Eastern Texas. About a third of the country looks like this, but it didn't used to. Just like here in the southeastern coastal plain, when we take fire out of the system, we lose all the things that make this place truly special, really unique. I mean, can you find muscadine, black cherry, tulip tree, water oak, loblolly pine, and Virginia creeper anywhere near your house? Where did all the endemics go? They went with the fire. And just like the choices that humans made to start burning the landscape so many thousands of years ago, the choice we've made to keep it out is now changing the world, and it's removing the uniqueness. We are homogenizing this world, and especially here in the southeastern United States. We have to fight that if we want to preserve the diversity that makes us who we are. I'm Patrick McMillan, wishing you your own exciting expedition.